Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon to who is with us in Lisbon, in the margins of the UN Ocean Conference. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us online or is now watching the video of the event. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for a new session of the Geneva Big Plastic Pollution Dialogues, co-organized with the International Pollutants Elimination Network, known as IPEN, the University of Gothenberg, the Swedish Institute for Marine Environment, and the Western and Indian Ocean Marine Science Association. We will start by screening a video produced by IPEN and Lena Gippert, professor in environmental law and member of the Center for Sea and Society at the University of Gothenburg, will take over after the video. She will be chairing and moderating this event.
We've all seen how plastics are polluting the planet, but they also contain invisible health threats. Plastics are mainly made from oil, mixed with thousands of chemicals, including many linked to cancer, brain damage, and infertility. Even worse, the oil and chemical industries plan to triple plastic production by 2050. Without even knowing it, we bring toxic chemicals into our homes and they're entering our bodies. They package the food and drinks we consume. They're in the synthetic fabric of the clothes we wear and in the bottles and toys we give our children. Yes, plastics are a public health threat throughout their entire life cycle. We can be exposed to toxic chemicals from the extraction and production processes, when we use plastic products and during their disposal. Chemicals in plastics don't go away, so recycling or disposing of plastics simply spreads the health problems around. The reality is plastic recycling is a hoax. It simply passes toxic chemicals on to others and poisons the circular economy. Western countries dump hazardous plastic waste on communities, threatening public health. And the oil and chemical industry's toxic plan is to burn the plastic waste as fuel, which is even more deadly. It poisons our air, food and bodies, plus contributes to climate change. The current situation is totally out of control, but there are changes we can make now to intervene at all stages. We should have the right to know when plastics contain dangerous chemicals. We must demand global policies to end the use of toxic chemicals in plastics. We must hold plastic makers financially responsible for the harm done by their products. We need to ban toxic waste recycling and plastic waste fuels. We must also end subsidies for the fossil fuel industry to reduce the volume of plastics produced and invest in safer, more sustainable materials. Only then can we begin to create a truly circular economy, one that protects our planet, our health, and our future.
So I want to welcome you all to this event. And with this introduction, the film was maybe some bad sound, but I think you got the message. That although we have chemicals that have in so many ways improved our lives, so with pharmaceuticals, pesticides, plastics, etc., these substances also brings severe risk to humans, also those not born yet, but also to the marine environment. So this event is about the invisible crisis, exceeding the limits of the pollution planetary boundary. And it aims at presenting new science about this pollution crisis, but also opportunities to tackle threats to human and marine life caused by pollution and primarily from chemical substances. My name is, as said, Lena Gippert. I'm a professor in environmental law at the University of Gothenburg, and I'm a part of the Center for Sea and Society and a Center for Future Chemical Risk Assessment and Management Strategies. I will be moderating this event today, arranged by the Center for Sea and Society at the University of Gothenburg, International Pollutant Elimination Network, IPEN, WIOMSA, Western Indian Ocean Marine Science Association, and the Swedish Institute for the Marine Environment. And during these 1.5 hours, we will have 3 introductory presentations, followed by a panel discussion. And in the end, we will also open up for questions and comments from the audience here in Lisbon. We are live streaming this event and want to warmly also welcome you around the globe following us. We will start off with presentations by 2 of the 14 co-authors of a publication called Outside the Safe Operating Space of the Planetary Boundary for Novel Entities. In this publication, authors conclude that rates of production and releases of hazardous chemicals exceeds these boundaries. So the first presenter is Martin Hasselöv, a professor in analytical environmental chemistry at the Department for Marine Sciences at the University of Gothenburg, and also part of the Center for Future Risk Assessment and Management Strategies. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you, Lena, and good day, everybody. So, let's see if we can, thank you. The paper, as Lena mentioned, deals with the planetary boundaries of novel entities. And I will come back shortly about how we define novel entities as a term for pollution. But first, a few words about the planetary boundary concept. Planetary boundaries is a science-based anthropocentric assessment framework that takes a holistic Earth system science view on the planet and its systems. And it has been described as science-based thresholds underpinning the safe operating space for humanity. And if you can give me the control here on the slide, please. Next slide. And okay, here we go. So the planetary boundaries assess the key components that regulate the stability and the resilience of the Earth systems. And in more simple terms, you can say how much anthropogenic abuse the planet can take before the life support system for humanity is at risk. And 9 such boundaries had been identified. And if we start to look at them in a graphical manner in this wedge diagram, you can see that this was the view before our study started. And it was concluded that high risk was found for disturbances of the natural biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as increasing risk for land system use and climate change, and a very high risk for biosphere integrity in terms of species extinction rate. The chemical pollution impact that was later renamed novel entities had not been comprehensively assessed, although there were important contributions made. So with that, I'll go to how the chemical pollution was renamed novel entities. It was to include a more holistic view of pollution. So novel entities include then new substances as well as new forms of existing substances. It includes chemicals and other new types of materials that has not been previously known to the Earth systems and biological systems. So for example, plastics and also engineered nanomaterials as other examples. We have also the natural occurring elements, for example, heavy metals that are remobilized by anthropogenic activities also included. But okay, we have the planetary boundary concept and we have the pollution. But if we think of the combination pollution of an entire planet. I think that is almost incomprehensible to take in. I mean, we often think about the planet, I do, as vast, wide stretches of ocean with its deep abyss, lots of atmosphere to dilute any pollution. We think of pristine places, forests, mountains, and so on. But this concept has also been the ruler of the management to pollution, the dilution, longer chimneys, longer effluent pipelines, and so on. But in the previous paper, the 2015 from Stefan et al., novel entities was concluded if it was global concern when exhibiting widespread distribution, persistence, mobility across scales, and accumulation in both organisms and the environment with potential negative impacts on vital Earth system processes or subsystems. And if we now look at any clues of such pollution, I will start to visit the Henderson Island. It's a small, unpopulated island in the middle of the South Pacific. It's home to a number of endemic bird species, but no humans. It is thousands of kilometers from the nearest continents, and this tropical paradise is basically flooded with marine litter, plastic debris. Plastic pollution tends to show up in the most unexpected places. We have seen microplastics in the North Pole ice, as well as the deepest water under the North Pole, and we have other scientists have documented microplastics as well as Antarctica and Greenland ice cores and in the deep sea. So we can see here plastics end up, it will distribute with the ocean currents in the most unexpected places of the planet. But how about other pollution sources, molecules, ions, and so on? Well, there are not very comprehensive monitoring programs for pollution, but metals is an exception. And this shows a transect through the entire Atlantic Ocean, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, and you can see here a cross-section of lead concentration, showing a pervasive pollution into the ocean interior. It's made in the North Atlantic. You have the deep water formation that transport the lead down into the deeper ocean. The lead is mainly coming from atmospheric input. Its main source have been leaded gasoline, and this is an example where already from 100 years ago, companies of the automobile and the fuel industry took a decision to use lead in gasoline, although the knowledge was available that it was a human brain development impairment, and also that there were alternatives at hand. But this led to a technology lock-in of large infrastructure that kept research and implementation of alternatives out. So it took 50 years of excessive global use before the atmospheric effluent was starting to lower in some countries, and several more decades before it was regulated in most countries. So this is just one example of such a lock-in effect and global pollution. But there are also other ways that chemicals can move around the globe. Of course, they can be transported by trade as chemicals, as commodities and waste, but also by these natural processes. Depending on the properties, they might move with ocean currents through the atmosphere, and also, as indicated here in this grasshopper mode, semi-volatile compounds, such as many of the persistent organic pollutants, They are volatilized near the tropics and then condensated further to the north, to the high latitudes, leading to often an accumulation, high concentration in the environment and in biota in the Arctic ecosystems. So we have now several clues about transport around the globe, but we also need to say we have changed a bit the perspectives on pollution over the years from some of these to the left here, one cartoon from the 70s about point sources outside factories, and the other picture of the ship, it's showing hazardous waste incineration at sea. So both examples of careless or unmanaged practices leading to big problems in localized area. And these, of course, can still happen, but we have now today a multitude of uses. This is the ocean example, a multitude of uses of chemicals. We have a lot of different compounds coming from society, and we have here both chemicals in form of the persistent organic pollutants. We have the chlorinated compounds, perfluorinated substances. We have plastic and pharmaceuticals, personal care products, and so on. So with one of our co-authors was publishing this study where they looked at all the inventories of chemicals and concluded that it was not 100,000 chemicals in society as was previously given. It was over 350,000. And of those, 50,000 were confidential, about 70,000 were ambiguously described, so big uncertainty in the numbers. And the same team also published this study where they scrutinized 63 different types of data sources on chemicals in plastics and could allocate 10,000 substances used in plastics. And out of those, over 2,400 that were persistent by accumulating toxic or hazardous profiles. So these additives of plastics is showing that it's not only the plastics that is a problem here. There's lots of chemicals associated. And with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague here, Bethany.
Thank you so much, Martin. I think what we concluded is that there is scientific evidence of this global pollution. And now over to Bethany Carney-Almroth, that is professor in ecotoxicology at the University of Gothenberg. And Bethany has been active in communicating the plastic issue for a long time, and now also a co-author of this publication. I hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us, both here in the room and online. And I would like to start off with just reiterating what Martin said. We know something about the global spread of chemicals. We know a lot about the global spread of plastics. We have a lot of unknowns regarding the chemicals that are out there in production and the chemicals that are in plastic materials. This study here that I'm showing you is from colleagues in Sweden who are looking at 130,000 different scientific papers using AI to analyze those and looking at like what kinds of chemicals are we studying? What do we know something about the effects of? And there they found 3,500 chemicals, so only 1% of the chemicals that are in production. And those were mostly pharmaceuticals, biocides, metals, plant production products, and REACH substances. So these are the chemicals under European chemicals legislation. So again, a lot of things we don't know. And another study also found that when we're looking at drivers of global change, the number of studies that are addressing chemicals as a driver is less than 0.5%. So with that, there's a lot of things we don't know. We don't know which chemicals are out there. We don't know where they're going. We don't know what their effects are. We most definitely don't know what their effects are in the environment. The total number of chemicals that we have a good understanding of their impacts in the environment is 65. So we know what 65 chemicals are doing in the environment out of 350,000. So vast knowledge gaps. And then we were tasked with trying to understand how all of these novel entities are affecting the planet. So what's going on a planetary scale? And this was a massive task given the lacks of knowledge that we have, the data gaps that we have. So we spent a long time trying to figure out how are we going to do this. A lot of the other boundaries worked with looking at the Holocene-like periods, like what was the temperature back then, what was carbon dioxide levels then, what was the pH in the ocean, and how has that changed to the Anthropocene where we are today. We couldn't do that with the novel entities because by definition, they did not exist. So they didn't exist before humankind, and now they're here. The baseline background levels should technically be 0, which is a number that is inoperable and not very effective in driving any discussions about change. So instead, we looked at the chemicals and products through their life cycle from extraction. So for plastics, 98 or 99% of that will be fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are also a feedstock for a lot of chemicals. From extraction then into production, where the novel entities are being made. And then we have products that are being used and coming out onto the market or going into industrial uses. And then waste management or lack of waste management. And every step of the way, these entities can be leaking out of our hands, out of society, into the environment. The next step was then to try to understand what these things are doing in the environment. So what kind of impact are they having? And then taking that knowledge and information and scaling up from a short time period at a local scale to something global. And that was, as you can understand, a massive undertaking. But we rewrote that life cycle into words and what we call our impact pathway, going from extraction to production of novel entities, release into the environment, trying to understand their fate and distribution, the impact of what they were, and then finally disturbances to Earth system processes. And this moved us from a very technological domain into the environmental domain, which is where we wanted to be and what we were trying to understand. So in this impact pathway, we tried to find 3 control variables that we could use to try to understand what's going on the planetary scale, and we called these production and use volumes, environmental mass and or concentrations, and Earth systems effects. So 3 different sets of variables that we could look at to try to understand the planetary boundaries and whether or not they had been transgressed. In doing this, we had to have a hard look at the data that was available to us and try to regulate what we were putting into our assessment and understand if it was feasible. Is the data there? Can we get a hold of the data? Is it relevant? Does it connect cause and effect? Can we see a consequence of exposure in the environment? And comprehensive, does it capture the planetary scale of what we're talking about? And I'll just give you some quick examples of what we found in those different control variables. So first starting with production volumes of chemicals and plastics. And then importantly at this step, still in the technological sphere, the share of chemicals on the market that have regulatory data or are being assessed. And here we have some evidence. Soon we'll have some evidence there. So this is one of the figures from the paper where we just tried to show what trends look like over time. And this is trends in production of plastics and a number of different chemicals. It's increasing and will continue to increase. I'm taking an example here regarding regulatory assessment from REACH, which is the European chemicals legislation, as I said, and it's one of the most robust in the world. Here, out of the 350,000 chemicals that are registered for production, we think there are about 143,000 on the European market. The REACH legislation requires that chemicals must be submitted as dossiers when they're produced or imported over 1,000 kilos per year. So these are industry-submitted dossiers with toxicity data on the hazards of these chemicals. 48,000 dossiers have been submitted, but the European Chemicals Agency strives to check 25% of those, and 75% were lacking in important information. So again here, more knowledge gaps on the toxicity of the chemicals that we're using in our societies. So if we look at release then, moving on to the next step into the environment, we looked at emission of plastics and hazardous chemicals. And this is another study that were one of the ones that we included in our evaluation, looking at release of plastics to the environment. And this study set the baseline level at 8 million tons per year, which is the amount of plastics that were released into the environment in 2010. And that's the goal. And I would also like to point out that that's a pretty high number already there. And the yellow bar that you see on the top of the chart is business as usual. So if we continue producing and we continue to increase the amounts of plastics and chemicals that we're producing, they will increase in the amounts released into the environment. The middle part, the blue part, is if we have very ambitious strategies to reduce the kinds of plastics that we're using, to increase waste management infrastructure, we will still see a big increase in release to the environment. So even with all our ambitious strategies, we will not be able to curb release of plastics to the environment. This paper also looked at differences between countries. So the panels on the sides show us high income, upper middle income, and lower income countries. And there are big differences there based on consumption patterns, economies, and waste management infrastructure. So this is not evenly distributed across the globe. And then finally, the impacts that we're seeing in the environment, the toxicity of chemical pollution and disturbances to the biosphere by plastic pollution. And here we use two different terminologies because toxicity of chemicals generally thinks of chemicals as molecules, while plastics are a physical material that can have other types of effects based on their physical nature, like entanglement and damage, causing flooding, land mass changes with waste management, and so on. One of our co-authors, Peter Franke, who is an expert in life cycle impact assessment, did this calculation, and he took two examples of chemicals, one pesticide and then BPA, which is a polymer used in plastics. Looked at their production volumes, their uses, their emissions to the environment in air, land, and soil, and then looked at the toxicity data that we have on those chemicals and calculated that those two chemicals occupy 1,000th of the space, the safe space for chemicals in freshwater systems in Europe. 2 out of 350,000. I'm going to keep saying those numbers because they scare me. Then, we also looked at how the chemicals and plastics connect to the other planetary boundaries. So how are chemicals affecting stability of the planet and the health of the planet in other ways? So for example, biodiversity loss. Chemicals have been pointed out as a driver of biodiversity loss in adding a stressor to already stressed organisms across the planet. They're changing microbial communities in different water systems in the ocean environment. They're leading to climate change. There are strong connections between plastics and a lot of chemicals due to the fact that they're produced from fossil fuels. So some plastics are sometimes referred to as climate change in solid form. We see connections to ocean acidification, again, through similar mechanisms, changes through land usage, land systems, partly connected to extractive practices, but also to waste management. We have evidence of changes in nitrogen and phosphorus flows through chemicals production, but also through changes in the environment, in the microbial communities that we can see. So if I sum up all of this in one slide, just to give you a quick overview, these are our control variables, and this is the places where you're putting in data to populate this impact pathway. Our conclusion was for most of them that yes, we have exceeded the boundaries. We have pushed ourselves beyond the safe operating space. For the first two, we use the words we can't say that we're safe because they're a bit more disconnected as they are very technological from the environmental domain. So our conclusion was this: we have pushed beyond the safe operating space. We are currently destabilizing Earth's processes through our production and use of chemicals and plastics, which is highly unregulated, highly unmanaged. And finally, I'd just like to land on this slide, showing a Guardian article which was published when this paper was released. And this Guardian article trended #1 on Reddit globally in the days following the release of the article. And this is a group of people that are not academics, they're not politicians, they're not necessarily following this kind of work. But we tapped into something here. This was, and I list some of the subreddits here, which I found a bit entertaining. But we beat out COVID, we beat out Donald Trump, we beat out gaming platforms. People around the world were concerned about this. People are worried about this. This is something that we need to talk about more, and this is something that people do care about. So now that I'm done describing the entire problem, I'd like to finish there and ask Björn to let us know how we're going to go forward from here.
Thank you, Bethany, and I agree those are scary numbers. But now, over to Björn Breler, the General Manager of and International Coordinator of IPEN, International Pollutants Elimination Network. Björn and IPEN work with providing local organizations in the Global South and East with community-based science on toxic chemicals and exposure to give them opportunities to become actors to impact the global policies. So welcome, Björn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, both here physically and online. So I'm going to say, we talked about novel entities. We can also call those toxic chemicals or hazardous chemicals. I'll be speaking about this, as well as the invisible harm to human health and the environment, and policy opportunities. Most people think about plastic pollution through what's visible, but we're going to go a little bit what's invisible based on what we heard today about the chemical boundaries of our planet being broken through. Just a few words about IPEN. IPEN is a global network of organizations, over 600 across 127 countries. And we work on global policy as well as local realities. And as you can see in the next slide, IPEN is led by local, national, and international leaders. These are organizations, many are founders of their organizations, who work on these issues because they have constituencies they wish to protect, which is also the ocean, as well as the people who live in their communities from toxic chemicals and pollutants. The way IPEN works is we have a mission. That mission is for a toxic-free future for all. We work at the local level, we generate information and data at the local level, then we bring them to international venues and policy spaces like this one here at the UN Ocean Conference, and then we generate that policy change to leverage financial and technical resources for work on the ground to change reality on the ground. And the way that we do this is through solutions. Through science, we generate data, and then because these issues are so large, as you've just heard, what we do is we move to change public policy to be focused on protecting the public. The public includes public spaces like the ocean. So a few words here. What you've just heard is quite scary. We've broken through planetary boundaries about what are the impacts of chemicals on the environment. And we've been there before, actually. They realized many years ago that there was these chemicals known as persistent organic pollutants, or known as POPs. And when they realized that these are chemicals that persist in the environment, meaning they stay for a long time. They're organic in the way that they can move from mother to child, both in the womb and through breast milk, meaning you're transferring toxic chemicals from a mother to a child at the early stages. And they're pollutants, meaning they also cause cancer or have negative health impacts, also relating to infertility or reproductive harm. Those chemicals, persistent organic pollutants, began to be addressed in 1998 at a global policy level. That is also when IPEN was formed, 25 years ago, at the Stockholm Convention's first negotiation committee. This image on the right shows the first action we organized in IPEN. As delegates walked into the venue, women wore busts to symbolize pregnant women, holding the busts and their stomachs in their hands, saying that our future is in your hands. These are chemicals that threaten the future, and this is a choice that that we are taking to have chemicals that impact our society being produced. So we're saying, get control of those. The image in the middle is from an Inuit community of indigenous peoples in the Arctic, where these chemicals from thousands of miles away are produced, and they transfer to the Arctic regions. So this is a human rights, this is indigenous people's rights issue as well. And on the right is where we talk about IPEN, these organizations working together to begin to make interventions and contribute to the global policy process. So when you look at the Stockholm Convention, they began with 12 chemicals known as the Dirty Dozen. Since then, they've added 31 new chemical substances or groups of substances as well. Most of those are pesticides, which are released directly into the environment. The other ones many are connected to the production of plastics, as well as the release through plastic waste. Let's say a couple of words here about pesticides. So look here, with the Oceans Conference, everyone loves the ocean, they love the waterways. You're spraying directly pesticides or poisons to the environment into the ground. It runs off into this waterway. What's downstream from that waterway? Well, downstream is livelihoods, fisheries that are impacted by these chemicals and pesticides. So this is a direct threat. You're looking through the water on the pesticide issue. If you look at older documentations, pesticides are meant to kill pests or insects. Those insects are part of the food chain. This is a report from The Guardian talking about how fisheries are collapsing through the food chain getting poisoned by pesticides. So we produced a report in 2018. We released this at the Our Oceans Conference. And just to read here, persistent herbicides are believed to pose one of the greatest risks to ecosystems and organisms in the Great Barrier Reef. Right? So this is a direct correlation based on the data and science. So looking ahead, plastics now. Everyone's talking about what you can see visibly in plastics. I'm going to express to you some information that's going to show you, based on the science, how plastics are poisoning the marine environment as well as the human environment, which is also our health. So first, about what are plastics? So plastics are essentially carbon, oil and gas, and chemicals combined to make a material. You cannot have plastics without chemicals. Many of those chemicals, as you've heard before, are harmful. We know at least a quarter are harmful, meaning they are hazardous, but there are others that are still, the science is not in to know they are more harmful chemicals. And so based on this information, what are the chemicals that are being produced for plastics that are threatening us? So here at the Ocean Conference, you'll see many of these plastics images of plastics on the shoreline. The ones on the left will draw your attention to the dolphin there surrounded by this unfortunate situation. But it's also unfortunate the toxic chemicals that you do not see that actually threaten the environment as well as the health of this dolphin and other marine life. So let's talk about those. In 2018, or sorry, last year in 2021, we produced a report based on the science showing what are the chemicals that threaten fisheries. So as it says here, the fertility of male fish decreased as bioconcentrated, persistent endocrine disrupting chemicals. So endocrine disrupting chemicals, your endocrine system is your hormone system. The marine life have also an endocrine system. That is what you're triggering, and you're changing the hormone system of this marine life. So when we released this report, we were showing that fisheries, there's a blind spot to how toxic chemicals threaten fisheries. They go across the protected marine borders. They go across the idea of fishing quotas. They actually threaten the ability for marine life to reproduce. So let's look at the plastics life cycle now, right? So if you look from extraction, from oil and gas to production, use, recycling, and so on. Most are talking about ocean dumps, but there's much more to it. So we talk about the additives again. What are the chemicals of concern? Known as endocrine disrupting chemicals. This is a report produced with the Endocrine Society. The Endocrine Society are clinicians, pediatricians, scientists working on hormone health, obesity, diabetes, many different diseases related to your hormone, your endocrine system. We produced a report to highlight what are some of the chemicals of concern that are produced for production of plastics. So at the input, you put chemicals in. At the same time, you're watching the production of plastics escalate, and you're moving from fossil fuel as a fuel to a material or a plastic, if you can say the same. So in this change of the fossil fuel sector, using the feedstock of oil for energy, now for materials, you're seeing a growth pattern. The green represents the projected sales of chemicals. The orange represents the projected growth of plastics over the time ahead. This is where we are right now. So if you heard the earlier report, you were talking about we're breaking through planetary boundaries. The projection is that we're going to skyrocket through those into the future. The amount of growth of chemical production and plastics is set to skyrocket. What does this mean? Well, based on the data over decades, a report, I would say a book came out called The Countdown. It talks about the impact of many of these chemicals known as PFAS, and these are alphabet soup, so I won't try to cover everything. But PFAS chemicals, flame retardants, brominated flame retardants, phthalates, and BPA, there's reports and documents that show worldwide fertility has dropped more than 50% over the past 50 years and are continuing to decline. That correlation to these chemicals is in this document, in this book to read. That's concerning. You're seeing production go up. You're seeing the ability to reproduce go down. So what does IPEN do about this? This is a serious situation. So what the IPEN organization does is we work with our local organizations and we generate data. For example, earlier last year in December, we released a report. We collected plastics from beaches and we tested them for persistent organic pollutants. And we showed that every sample had POPs in those, and as well as endocrine disrupting chemicals. We also generated data about plastics products, baby bottles containing BPA, toys containing flame retardants, clothing, most of your clothing is made of plastics, containing PFAS or the forever chemicals. So, okay, don't freak out, but don't freak out so you lose hope, because you actually have to have hope to move on and identify the problem here. So as we begin to conclude, what is the action plan for hope? You have to identify the common problem, because if we identify different problems, everyone's going to have different solutions for those. So we need to discuss the solutions, create rules and laws, and enforce these laws. So the problem, global chemical pollutants. Solutions, controls, because we're out of control right now. Opportunity. Well, we've been here before. Under the Stockholm Convention, we have banned several PFAS chemicals. working at the local level where people have been poisoned in their water, working with firefighters who are exposed through PFAS chemicals, and working with the media. We've had many chemicals listed to the Stockholm Convention to be banned. So in our final stages here, what are the opportunities? This took place this year in Kenya in February, where the global community agreed to begin launching a treaty on plastics. And if you think about that, the opportunity is the Plastics Treaty provides an opportunity to protect human health and the environment from toxic chemicals used to make plastics, as well as ban production of those chemicals that are used to make plastics that are harmful, and shift their responsibility from the public to recycle and clean up the beaches to the producers of these chemicals and the plastic products. So to conclude, toxic chemicals are increasing. Plastics are made of carbon and chemicals. Many of those chemicals are harmful. And the treaty is an opportunity. And I think just to say, it was said earlier this week, Greta Thunberg from Fridays for a Future said, instead of looking for hope, start creating the hope yourself. So many of these reports are online, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Björn, and thank you for now giving us the possibility now to talk about solutions and the way forward. For that, we have a distinguished panel to help us give us some new perspectives. So we have Mr. Luis Vallas, current Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador, overseeing environmental affairs at the ministry. Luis Vallas has extensive experience in multilateral environmental negotiations as a former Vice Chancellor, Chair of the Stockholm, Basel and Rotterdam Conventions, and as a diplomatic officer that has served in Ecuadorian permanent mission at the UN in Geneva. Also, he has been a senior diplomat in Ecuador's embassies in Stockholm and Madrid, and have an academic background in international comparative law, diplomacy and international relations. Most welcome to the panel. And so we also have with us, let's see here, Therese Karlsson. She started out as working with plastics and plastic litter, and did her PhD on sources of plastics in the marine environment. And now she's moved to working more with the chemicals and policy as a science and technical advisor of IPEN. And and finally, we have also Jessica Brown, Head of Engagement for the Back to Blue initiative, a partnership of the Economist Group and Nippon Foundation to tackle chemical pollutions in the ocean. The Back to Blue initiative convenes a global group of stakeholders from business, finance, policy and civil society to catalyze progress of ocean pollution. She also advises clients on their sustainability, social impact and responsible business strategies. So you are very much welcome. And I think we will start also with a question to you, Jessica. I know that you recently published a report and was co-author to this report on invisible wave, where you looked at chemical pollutions. And I heard you did more than hundreds of interviews. So I'm curious to know the different perspective that you met on these chemical pollution crises.
Thank you. Yes, we spoke, along with my colleagues, we spoke with 100 stakeholders, more than 100 stakeholders from policy, from the private sector, scientists and NGOs, and we heard a really wide range of responses to the question of how big a problem is marine chemical pollution and what should we do about it. Typically from the scientific community and from the NGO community, we heard very similar stories to what we've heard today, that this is an urgent crisis which needs to be addressed immediately. What was quite striking, though, is the gap. between that perspective and the perspective from government, typically from business, from investors, which is we don't know anything about this issue. Would you like to talk about plastics? Because we know about plastics, but when it comes to chemical pollution in the ocean, we haven't even thought about it. We haven't even begun to consider it. And this is something that we found quite worrying because, you know, we're hearing here that this is an urgent problem, but the decision makers who are able to address it don't even know about this problem. It's not on their agenda. One of the big challenges, and as Bethany mentioned and as our other presenters mentioned, is the data. The data that exists is pretty patchy. It tends to be in parts of the ocean that surround developed countries where there is, you know, better capacity for research. And what the scientists we spoke to said is, we don't have perfect data, but we know enough to know we need to act. What we heard from others was we don't have compelling or rigorous enough data to make regulatory decisions. We don't have compelling or rigorous enough data to make business decisions. So again, that data gap is a real problem which needs to be overcome. It was mentioned earlier on the potential of having registers of chemicals. A global register of chemicals could be one way to address that. A science policy body, which is also on the agenda, could be another way to address that, ensuring that governments have access to the latest data. But ultimately, there's still a big gap there in terms of data, and that's something that we heard. One other big concern that we heard when we asked the question of what is the cost? What does marine chemical pollution cost us financially? You know, what are the costs to human health, to ecosystem services? We don't know the answer. We can't know the answer because we don't actually know the scale of the problem. So governments, businesses, they think in terms of dollar figures and numbers, and our inability to put a dollar figure on it means that it's really hard to make a very compelling argument to these decision makers. So as part of our study, The Invisible Wave, we did one very small piece of economic modelling looking at the Gulf of Mexico, and we were only able to do a very small piece because, you know, it's almost impossible to patch all the data together. And just from that one small case study, we found that there's $838 million in lost revenue each year to the US fisheries industry alone. And so if you extrapolate that out, the cost of pollution, of chemical pollution in the ocean is enormous. And one of the projects that we'd like to embark on next is to try to piece together a global map of the data that we have to understand where are the gaps in the data, but also to understand what is the cost, so we can start to communicate this more effectively to decision makers. One thing we heard that was unanimous across everyone we spoke to was there's a lack of awareness, that it's just not a well understood issue. I think from my own observation, if you look at all of the many, many meetings that are happening here in Lisbon this week, there is almost nothing on marine chemical pollution. There is a lot on plastics, and that's great, but that's a subset of the problem. There's almost nothing on the broader issue of chemicals in the ocean. So, you know, we need to get this onto the next UN agenda. And something that a lot of people mentioned to us was this question of, you know, how to make pollution sexy. And in a way, this is what's happened with plastics. You know, it's been an appeal to emotion. A lot of interviewees spoke to us about the Blue Planet effect, you know, the BBC series narrated by David Attenborough, that overnight propelled plastic pollution in the ocean into public consciousness. So how do we have that moment for chemical pollution? I had a really interesting conversation with the organisation that launched Strawless in Seattle, which was the first plastic straw campaign, which, as we know, you know, have gone really viral around the world. And she said, look, we know that stopping using straws isn't going to solve the plastics problem. That's not the point. The point is, as Bjorn mentioned, it's giving people a solution that they can own. And by stopping using straws, it means that they're talking to their friends about it. When they're in restaurants and they say no straw, all of a sudden everyone at the table says, why not? It means that they think more. And so it's a kind of gateway drug, if you like, to halting single-use plastics. And so, you know, that's a question that we were asked again and again by the interviewees, is how do we make chemical pollution that have the same sort of currency in the public mind, something that's invisible. So a really broad range of responses, Lena. You know, awareness is a big one, the most urgent one, closing the data gap, but also really critically closing that perception gap between science on the one hand and decision makers on the other.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think you bring up a lot of interesting topics now, also about communication and how we talk about these quite difficult issues. But now over to you, Louis. You were recently, as I heard, in Dakar for a meeting on the plastic treaty, and we just heard how much toxic chemicals plastic brings. So do you think that the plastic treaty could be a way to solve these issues, or what role will the treaty have?
Well, good afternoon, and I would like to thank you first for organizing this so important event. I would like to thank the University of Gothenburg, IPEN, the Stockholm Institute for the Marine Environment, and also the Geneva Environment Network. And coming to your question, yes, I think the treaty will help. It has to help. It must help to what we are discussing. We have heard this morning the UN General Secretary, and we have heard him before also about the triple crisis and how plastic pollution affects the triple crisis: pollution, loss of biodiversity, and climate change. And we need to work on that. We heard the General Secretary, the Secretary General this morning also about the amount of plastics on the oceans. He mentioned and he compared the surface of France that we have in the oceans of plastic, which is horrible. And I think we need to freak out, Bjorn. Scientists, they need to take us from the jacket and shake us. Politicians, negotiators, diplomats. We need to hear what we are talking here today. And it's important, the relation between the scientific community and the negotiators of the treaty. That's so important. The resolution from Nairobi opens that possibility, but I think we need to work and we need to put proposals on the table of how to articulate what you do as scientists and the data that you have with the negotiations. I think it's important to look at Stockholm Convention, that it was mentioned here. We have there the Persistent Organic Pollutants Review Committee, the POPs Review Committee. Also, we have such a committee in the Rotterdam Convention. I think it's important to look at this convention, also a Basel Convention, but that's different about implementation and compliance. But we need to look at them and take the good work that countries we have done in those conventions. I was in Stockholm when we signed Stockholm Convention. Actually, I was diplomat in Sweden. And I have seen the development of the Stockholm Convention. I've been part, as you mentioned, of the Bureau. And I think it's important, as I say, work already done there. But at the same time, we see that we have included in the annexes of the Stockholm Conventions, as Bjorn also mentioned, some chemicals. But still, some of those chemicals still being used in production of plastics. So come on, we need to do something, and we have to do something quick. we heard also this morning 350,000 chemicals we use. And this is so much. And a lot of those chemicals, we put them, of course, in nature. We put them back in nature and mainly in the oceans. Life starts in the oceans. We come from the oceans. And we are dumping this trash again back to the oceans. So what to do? I have a daughter who is a scientist, actually. And we need to link what they do and what you do and the data with the multilateral negotiations. And how do we do that? As I say, I cannot give you a straight answer, actually, but I can tell you that we have to do it. Again, we could look at Stockholm Convention, we could look at Rotterdam Convention, and we have to work with what we decide at UNEA 5.2 in Nairobi, the resolution 15/4. In the resolution, as I mentioned, we open the possibility of this link. So it's not only important to have the data, it's not only important to have the stakeholders dialogue that we already had. We had one in Dakar, and it was very good, actually. It was very important. We need to take that information, that contribution, and we need to bring it into the negotiation table. We need, as I say, to shake negotiators and tell them, this is what's happening, and you have to work with this evidence, with this scientific evidence. Again, it's mentioned also in the resolution from Nairobi that we need to work on the whole life cycle of plastics. Of course, recycling is not enough. We know that only 10% of the plastic we use is recycled. And from the year 2000 until now, after 20 years, we have doubled the production of plastics in the world. We know that if we want to kill ourselves, we just put our heads in a plastic bag, and we close it little by little, and then we die. We are doing the same with the world. We are putting a huge plastic bag in the world, and unfortunately, we are closing that bag little by little. We have to stop that. We need to freak out, because that cannot still be going, and we need to work on that. Yes, the treaty and the negotiation we have in front of us, it is an opportunity. I see it as a big opportunity. Time is running. We have until 2025 to have a diplomatic conference that we hope it will be in Ecuador, in Galapagos Islands, actually. We have to see, but it will be important. I'm from Ecuador, as you know, as you mentioned, and we have the Galapagos Islands. That is not only a patrimony of Ecuador, but of the whole humanity, and we have to keep. It's already affected, like many islands, like actually all islands in the world are affected. Our coasts are affected with plastic pollution, and we need to work with that. Half of the marine mammals are affected with plastic pollution. The turtles, 86% of the turtles, marine turtles, are affected with plastic pollution. Marine birds, half are affected already. So there is the evidence, and we need to work with that evidence. So again, what do we need? We need to put this scientific evidence, a science-valid, as you mentioned, with as a tool, as essential tool, with the multilateral decision-making. And the treaty that we are going to start negotiating soon in the INC, in the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee, is the opportunity. Again, thank you very much. And of course, I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Valles. And also what I hear is a challenge for the scientists, and not least to communicate. And I think, Therese, you have transferred from the academic life to another position where you do a lot of communication. And I heard that you were just in a conference with the Stockholm and Basel and Rotterdam conventions, where there was actually decisions now on regarding the control of some of the most toxic chemicals. But in light of what you do now and what you have seen at this conference, what do you see as the first steps to take now? What is missing?
Thank you, Lena, and thanks to everyone that is here listening and online. I want to start by apologizing in advance because I will not be able to join you for the Q&A as I need to run in and do an intervention because these messages need to be communicated in all arenas. Luckily, my colleague Björn will be able to answer any questions you have about the work that we do. So, BRS COPs. There's a lot of new topics, maybe for some of you here. So if you're not familiar with BRS COPs since before, this is one of those key meetings where the international community comes together to make decisions about some of the most toxic chemicals in the world. They come together to make decisions about our future and our health. And this closely connects to the health of the oceans, because the oceans are still acting as global dumping grounds for the chemicals that we use and produce. And frankly, it will not be possible to reach any of the targets if we don't address toxic chemicals in the oceans. It will not be possible to restore ecosystems. It will not be possible to restore fish stocks if we don't address toxic chemicals. And this invisible crisis is often overlooked because you cannot see it. So since we can't see chemicals, one of the first things that we need to do is that we need to talk about it. And through that, make it the invisible visible. Another thing that we need to do is that we need to start looking at chemicals as groups. Because for the longest times, we've been looking at chemicals one by one. We have a massive amount of chemicals. When it comes to decision making, or when it comes to research even, we're looking at them one by one. That is not only very time-consuming, but it also means that oftentimes banned chemicals get substituted for other equally toxic chemicals. At BRS COPs this year, one important step forward was taken. As a group of chemicals known as, I'm sorry to throw even more abbreviations at you, PFHXS, was listed for elimination. And these chemicals have been used in firefighting foams, in food packaging, in clothing. They are very persistent and they're very toxic. But now they will no longer be allowed to be used. And that's a great step forward. However, they are only a small group within the larger group of what's known as forever chemicals, PFAS, which is chemicals that are found in the blood of all of us. And we need to address the entire group of chemicals in order to move forward and to protect future generations, as well as the oceans. Finally, the area that I spent years studying. I started working with plastic pollution because I sailed across the Atlantic. During that trip, almost every day, we would see plastic floating by our boat. So my focus from the beginning was on the visible problem. And the more I researched, the more I studied this area, the more I realized that the real problems, or the big problems, many of the impacts that we see from plastics are actually from the chemicals. Because just as Björn said, plastics are essentially chemicals and carbon. So if we're going to talk about plastics, we need to talk about the invisible parts and the visible problems of them as well. So in summary, in order to safeguard future generations and our oceans, we need to talk about chemicals. Talk to your colleagues, talk to your governments, talk to your friends, to make them visible and to push for global controls. And when it comes to policy, we need to make decisions about groups of chemicals and not look at them one by one. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Therese. Before opening the floor here, I just want to ask Jessica, do you want to add something in relation to the options that we have now to go forward?
Yeah, thank you very much. Look, I think Therese has touched on international policy, but just to look at our policy making at a national level, because I think one thing that we found is that it's very cautious, typically, regulation of chemicals at the national level, and very reactive. And so there's a few principles that can be used to design policies and regulation at a national level. Therese, you mentioned one of them, and that's critically important, regulating chemicals in groups. One thing that we know is that the pace of innovation in the chemical sector is so much faster than the pace of innovation in the regulatory space. Regulators just can't keep up. So regulation needs to be flexible and designed for a future state, not what we have now. Because as you said, if we're going through regulating every chemical that's a problem now, we're never going to keep up. The other principle is to introduce the precautionary principle. At the moment, the onus is really on regulators to prove that a particular substance is harmful. Switching that onus onto producers and users to prove that it's safe would be an enormous step in the right direction, and that it's essential as well. The REACH legislation in the EU is great, it's excellent, but it's really important to remember that this is very much the exception. It's not the rule at all. And so the question of how to implement REACH-like legislation in other parts of the world is a really critical one. Geography is a really important point that hasn't been mentioned yet, but it's so important to mention. We saw earlier some graphs which showed the projected growth of chemical production. But the other really interesting story in that is the way that the global shift of production is taking place. So by 2030, just in 8 years, more than 50%, I've got it in my notes somewhere, I hope I'm getting that right, will be in Asia. Asia is very, very much the centre of chemical production and use, and will become even more so in the future. So again, where the commercial innovation is happening is a different place to where the regulatory innovation is happening. So that's another gap that we need to close. It's really important to make sure that we can't have this sort of regulatory arbitrage where global companies are able to move their operations to places where regulation is less onerous. At the same time, you know, just putting well-designed legislation in place is not enough. You know, it needs to be implemented. It needs to be enforced. Governments need to have capacity to do this. So that's a real challenge. How do we do this well? And I think for regulation, that is a really critical component. Just something else I'd like to touch on briefly is around industry, because you know, we are talking about a huge global industry here, one of the biggest industries in the world. And so it's not just, the solutions can't just be regulating the industry out of existence, but supporting that industry to transition. It's really critical just to understand the complexity and the scale of the chemicals sector. Chemicals are in 95% of manufactured products in the world, 95%. So we're not talking about a small subsector of the global economy here, we are talking about the global economy. So to think that lobbying the chemicals industry to change will be effective is naive, it won't be. Change is going to be very, very complex, long-term, expensive. We're talking about a transition here within the chemical sector on par with the energy sector transitioning to deal with climate change. That's the type of scale we're talking about. So just asking them to do better or regulating isn't going to help. What we really need to do is create economic incentives. Remember, these are businesses, that's what they respond to. So how do we create economies where there is incentive and a profit to be made from transitioning? We're already seeing that there's a growing market for products that will help other industries undergo their own sustainable transitions, and that's really encouraging. So BASF, for example, the world's largest chemical producer, says that by 2025, 1/3 of its products will be in this category. They'll be helping the climate transition. Sumitomo Chemicals in Japan says that now 20% of its revenue comes from sustainable solutions. For the chemicals sector, there's something that was mentioned a few times in our interviews and always off the record because, you know, a lot of chemical industry people we spoke to didn't want to go on the record. This cognitive dissonance, right? The chemicals industry sees itself as this centre of innovation, and for a long time it was. You know, the 20th century economy was largely built on chemicals, and throughout the 1950s much of the post-war economic boom was centred on the chemical industry, but now they still see themselves like this, even though a lot of others say no, actually you're part of the problem now, not part of the solution. So how to get a cultural change within these organisations to say how do we rekindle and reharness that spirit of innovation to solve this new problem? Green chemistry is one way we can do that, and there's really, really promising innovations happening in the green chemistry space. So that's developing chemicals that reduce or eliminate their harmful qualities altogether. And there's a really vibrant startup scene in the green chemical space. Of course, with chemicals always, you know, it's a very low margins business. So to be successful, you need scale. So while it's great to have a startup scene, we need to get the big chemical companies really investing in green chemistry. And that means getting the whole value chain in working together. There was a case study that we used in our report of the American company Eastman, who developed a green chemical product called Omnia, and it's a solvent used in cleaning products, which is much, much, much less harmful. And they spent a lot of time and money, they worked with scientists to develop this great product, but their customers really were just not that interested because they're like, what, why? There's nothing forcing us to change. There's an inertia which needs to be overcome throughout the supply chain. So, you know, how to bring together consumer goods companies who can put pressure on chemical manufacturers, how to bring together financiers and investors. Sustainable investors that we spoke with said they'd never even heard of this problem, hadn't thought about it. So how to bring all different parts of the chemicals value chain together to look for solutions. The barriers are cost often. The technological readiness is there. In many, many cases, the technology exists to transition to much, much greener solutions. Scalability is an issue, and cost is an issue. So what we know is that it takes time and collaborative effort. So, you know, how do we address that? I think at an industry level, we need some sort of coalition of the willing. We see this here at the Ocean Conference. We've got industry coalitions on plastics, on shipping, on sustainable fisheries. There's nothing on chemicals. And yet we do know that there are some companies within the industry who are starting to think about this. There's very much a first mover disadvantage. No one wants to be the first one to put their hand up, but by coming together in a coalition, they can share data, they can move in lockstep, which gives, I guess, cover to those organisations. They don't want to be the first ones to put their hand up and say, we're really polluting. You know, they would prefer to be part of the, you know, sort of become open and transparent as they're going through their transition. Finance, I think, is the final thing. It's really, really getting the banks involved in this. As I said, we spoke to investors who there's no frameworks, there's no way of assessing the impact that chemical companies are having on the marine environment, which means that there's no benefit for them in investing because they can't assess it. So a big grab bag of solutions there, but I think there's a lot to be done on both the regulatory space, but also don't forget industry, and they operate in a different way, but anyone that's part of the problem also has to be part of the solution. So that's really the critical part there.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. I think that's also a call, if there is anyone in the audience that could answer to this. We have now some time for questions, and we already had some through the internet, but let's open the floor first. There is a microphone, speak clearly, and also please present yourself. Yes.
Hi there. My name is Antoinette Vermillier. I'm from the Gallifrey Foundation, based in Switzerland. I really wanted to thank you so much for such an informative and vitally important information for all of us to understand. I actually was interested in your poster for this event because it's understanding the connection between acidification and novel entity planetary boundaries. I think that they're very closely linked. Climate regulating ocean plants and animals are being destroyed by toxic pollution from chemicals and plastics. And yet that boundary shows acidification is not a problem. It's accelerating our path towards ocean pH 7.95 in the next 25 years. And we have to understand that those are the plants that provide our oxygen, and creatures are disappearing 50% over the last 50 years. So it's more dire than we actually are aware of. So my questions are, shouldn't chemical pollution be framed with the same urgency as climate change? Because you can't fix one and not fix the other. This is very, very important. And the other thing that's been interesting in your amazing insights is, why are we not looking at a fairly low-cost solution of wastewater treatments? At least then we're trying to stop water that is contaminated with some of the toxics going into the waterways. That could be a solution for industry as an EPR solution, perhaps. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. And short answers. Who want to take this, Björn or Bethany? Yeah.
So thank you very much for your question. And I very much agree with you. There are strong connections between chemicals and plastics and biodiversity and climate and ocean acidification, as I alluded to a little bit earlier. There is research ongoing here, but it's in our early days. I think we really need to increase the amount of work that we're doing in understanding those connections to provide the evidence, as Jessica was saying, where there's a lot of demand for it, to support decision-making at different levels within industries and within policymakers. Regarding wastewater treatment, I absolutely agree with you. This is something that, so that can be done at different places at industry level and industry effluents, and this is tying into sort of producer responsibility, and that they're not releasing things into the environment that they shouldn't be, and that maybe needs to be regulated through policy decisions on national or local levels. And wastewater from sewage can also be looked at. A lot of places in the world have non-existent even wastewater treatment. So this is something that we can work on even maybe together as the global community to increase that capacity too.
We have got several questions also from the web, and there is one I think is interesting. This is a present issue. How could we make this information more accessible to public, for example, for non-speaking English countries? The question comes from the fact that most activities undertaken are focused on English-speaking countries, forgetting the conservation is everyone's issue. And a similar question is, in many countries we have not enough studies to understand how much the problem is effect on our health and environment. How do we handle such lack of knowledge? I thought, Mr. Vyas, do you also think from most South African, South American, perspective? How do you, is this an are we excluding non-speaking English countries or groups of people?
Well, in one way, yes, but at the same time, you know, we have to work internally, well, at national level and regional level to be included. But yes, well, it was mentioned also here before, for instance, that Latin American countries and Caribbean countries, GRULAC countries, we are not, for instance, main producers of plastic. Actually, we are, if you take the whole world and the different regions, is actually the lowest production is from Latin American and Caribbean countries. But we do use, and also we're talking same about chemicals. So that doesn't mean that we should be a part or so in the negotiations and all the dialogues. We should be, of course, a part, and we think is very important that we include. No, but I think, you know, we have to take into consideration, yes, developing countries, and also it's important to take into consideration, for instance, small islands, developing states. That's very, very important, because the big effect, negative effect that we are receiving, for instance, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Islands, and also I mentioned, you know, for instance, in the Galapagos Islands, that is part of Ecuador. So to be included is important, but it is in our side too. It's not in general, it's in our side also to be part and to be a strong part in all the negotiations to contribute to multilateral negotiations in the environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a question here. And please, if you can put it short.
Yeah. Hello, I am Chiara Fasoli. I'm a master's student in Sweden for Sustainable Production and Utilization of Marine Bioresources, which is a very long name. So anyway, I wanted to ask, talking about inclusion, I can feel represented as a young individual right now, and it's actually scary to live in the world we're living in because of the data that you were presenting before. And I am a little bit tired of listening to lost opportunities when we are facing treaties or just actions to take in order to change something. So I wanted to ask you, specifically as a part of the government of Ecuador, how could you think about including more the youth, since we will have on our lives like a huge impact on the decision that we're taking right now? Do you have anything already in mind, or do you have anything that will actually be held in the future about this?
Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think it's so important what you just said. I tell you, I wasn't too young, but I was, I don't know, around 30-something years old when I went to Geneva to work in our permanent mission in Geneva to the UN. I was frustrated when I started, you know, the first year or so in the negotiations. Such a big frustration and also disappointment of many of the things. I'm not going to mention a particular one. But at the same time, I was taking care of the environmental issues, but I was also taking care of intellectual property matters at the WIPO. And then, you know, we start talking about human rights. And when we start talking about human rights in WIPO, which is not the correct place maybe in those days actually to start talking about human rights, but we were talking about the rights of blind people, of people with disability, for reading disability. And then we just mentioned, or I mentioned as a delegate, about the need to have this talking when we talk about intellectual property treaties. And then civil society WIOMSA, that's the organization from Spain, and the World Blind Organization from the US, they came to us. They came to me and say, we have a treaty, or we have that draft treaty about access for people with reading disabilities. And then we presented, and it was a success. What I want to say with that story is that we need to work with civil society. We need to work with young people. And about a sexy treaty, for instance, that you were mentioning before, I understand your frustration also, for instance, when you look at BRS, Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Conventions, when we need to work with some chemicals and introduce chemicals in the annexes. We've been negotiating sometimes until 5, 6 in the morning, the whole night negotiations, and without success. But when we talk about plastics and plastic pollution, I think it's different, because when we talk in Stockholm Conventions, when the other chemical conventions about asbestos or DDT or other chemicals, and sometimes we don't see, you know, or mercury when we talk about Minamata Convention, for instance, we don't see we don't feel the need. We might see and note when you talk about cadmium, lead, the danger of these chemicals, of these products in our health, in the environment. But when you talk about plastic and plastic pollution, you know what we are talking about. And young people is the ones that we need to talk about it too, because it's the future of the world, and it's the ones that push actually governments to talk about the plastic pollution and the urgent to have a treaty on this. I'm optimist. I'm optimist in this treaty, but we need to work closely with young people, with civil society, with NGOs, with the other conventions that, as I mentioned, because also time is short and for this negotiation. Minamata Convention, it took, I believe, 4.5 years to negotiate, yes. And at the other conventions, even more. Here we have a bit more than 2 years. But there is already a lot of material we could use, a lot of decisions from other conventions that we can use, and of course we need to use civil society, and then it's young people that we need to have it on board. Again, the question is how, because events like this one, where you can talk, the stakeholders dialogue, where we have different stakeholders and actors, but then is how we bring your contributions into the negotiations. And we don't want any more frustrations. We need to have these contributions on paper, and then to have it on, as I mentioned before, to have it on the table of our negotiations, to use those contributions. So again, you know, it's to work together. It's to work together. We are, and from our side, we are already members, as Ecuador, we are members of the committee, of the INC, of the Bureau of the committee. We are completely open to these discussions. We are completely open to your contributions, so we don't get these frustrations. At least we will try to avoid these frustrations. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have got so many interesting questions here by the internet. Questions like, how do we raise awareness among policymakers? How do we freak them out? And how do we implement decisions and policies, which is also important. But unfortunately, the time is running out, so I will just give you one sentence each to summarize. What is your key message? Starting with Martin. Just one sentence. One sentence.
We need to have the chemical transition, transformative change, hand in hand with the climate transition. And as Jessica pointed out, be aware of the industry perspectives where we're doing that. I think that is very interesting. Future look ahead.
Bethany?
I can offer a promise that given the knowledge that I have and the expertise that I have, that I will work very hard to communicate it to everyone who needs to hear it and that I will work very hard to make sure that the science comes into the ongoing negotiations so we can make sure our decisions are evidence-based.
Björn?
Great. Thank you for this. As policies are designed after the damage is done, on science, we make policy, we make the Stockholm Convention, we're seeing this now. To make the change, you have to shift the burden, these what are plastics and chemicals, which are viewed as assets from the private sector, and then that burden is on the public sector to clean up that mess. You have to shift the responsibility of us cleaning up the mess back to the producers who are making that mess.
Well, I take a little from what you just said, Björn, but I believe we are all in the same side. Governments, stakeholders, actors, civil society, NGOs, private sector, and what is on the other side? What we are fighting against is pollution, plastic pollution in this case, especially in the marine environment.
Thank you. Jessica?
Awareness, better data, better regulation, industry transformation, 4 steps. I said 5, 4.
Thank you so much. And a warm thank you to our panel for excellent insights and making this very difficult crisis to communicate and talk about, and making it somewhat more visible for us. So a warm thank you to you. And we also appreciate that you didn't not just talk about the crisis as such, but also the suggestions on how to come forward. And we also want to thank all you that participated here in Lisbon and online. And don't forget that we are many globally that are dedicated to make a change and make this invisible crisis of chemical pollution visible. Thank you all.